You're listening to A Slice of Therapy with me, Alan Parry. Can you imagine walking up to the door of a building and you can see that the building is open, so you push on the door and the door doesn't move. So you push on the door again. The thing still doesn't move, so you push a little bit harder and still nothing. So this time you really put your shoulder into it. You're pushing hard on the door. And yet it still doesn't move. You give it one final push. You've got your foot against it. You've got your shoulder against it. You've got both hands. And the door still doesn't move. And so frustrated, you take a step away for a break and you think, I'll try push it again in a minute. And then you notice somebody walk up to the door and they give it a pull and the door opens. You'd been pushing on this door the whole time. And yet you hadn't thought to pull. And it reminds me of an old adage that amidst all the kind of reams and reams of psychological theories that are out there, often the simplest things make the most sense. And one of the things that I particularly like is an old adage that basically says, as a rule of thumb, if something is working for you, do it more. And if something isn't working, try something else. And the important word there is try something else, because if something isn't working, then you can just playfully experiment at something else. And so when you were stood there with the door and you're pushing and pushing and pushing, you could see that it wasn't working. And so one good idea might be to try something else. And in that situation, the thing that you might have tried was its opposite. Don't push, but pull. And then the door opens. And this is true as well of social anxiety. Now, just to define social anxiety is that feeling of anxiousness that we get whenever we're with others. So when we're with others and it just doesn't feel particularly safe for us. Now, humans, of course, are social creatures, and so other people are there to nourish us, and we often get a lot of nourishment from being around people. And yet when we're feeling social anxiety, it can do the opposite. Because these other people, even though a part of us obviously wants to connect, we're not seeing them as an opportunity, we're seeing them instead as a threat. And the threat is that in that interaction, we fear that we might do something wrong, in quotation marks. So we'll be in this conversation, we'll start to get tense and nervous and tongue-tied because we'll be thinking, what are they thinking of me? Does this person even like me? Am I making a fool of myself? Am I causing offence somehow? Did I say the wrong thing there? Am I saying something stupid now? Do I look daft? And so the whole time that you're meant to be with this other person, you're focused instead on this kind of narrative. And that narrative is it's all focused on yourself. And so no wonder that things start to feel anxious. You see, social anxiety is a state that is premised on you focusing inward. And when you focus inward, guess what you're going to become? Any of us is going to become self-conscious. Focusing inward is actually the definition of being self-conscious because we're consciously focused on ourselves. And then when we become self-conscious, we start focusing inward even more. And then it gets into this vicious circle where we get more and more anxious, more and more tense. And this situation that could well be nourishing and connecting for us feels ever more uncomfortable and threatening. And it reminds me of That story at the beginning of the episode where we're pushing and pushing on that door. And yet it was only when we stopped pushing and did the opposite and pulled the door that it opened. And so the key here, I think, is also to do the opposite too. So rather than focusing on you, do the opposite of that. Because going back to that old adage, what you're doing isn't working. So why not experiment doing something else instead? Now, what you're doing is focusing on you. You're being self-conscious. So instead, what you could try is to focus on them and become other conscious instead. Now, you might be thinking, well, this all sounds well and good, and it makes sense not to focus on me because then I will be self-conscious, that I could actually focus on them and be other conscious instead. But how on earth do I do them? How on earth do I do that? Well, here's a couple of ideas. First one is ask them a question. You see, being other focused is all about throwing that meta narrative that you had onto the other person and getting very, very curious about them. And so you could just ask them a question, and it doesn't actually matter what the question is. The very act of asking a question throws the light outwards rather than inwards onto you. And so you instantly become other focused when you ask a question, irrespective of what the question is. It doesn't even have to be a good question, whatever that is. Second thing you can do is ask another one. A lot of conversation, especially when you're with somebody new, but also when you're with somebody that you've met before or even know well, is asking questions. And people love to be asked questions. People love the compliment of your interest in them. It's a most beautiful gift to be interested in another person, and they'll enjoy it. And so when I say ask a question, I don't mean once, I mean as often as you like. And with every question that you ask, you're throwing the focus outwards and you're waiting on their answer. And when they answer, get curious about what they say. Get really interested. Notice certain things, for instance, like what do they have in common with you? Find something complimentary about them. You don't even have to tell them, but you might decide to, because again, that puts the focus on that person once more. You can even, if you notice your own meta-narrative switching and focusing on you and saying, are you saying something stupid here? You could actually play that out in your head only, of course, but direct it more at them. Well, are they saying something stupid? Are they making a fool of themselves? And you'll find that they're not, just like you weren't. But nonetheless, it just throws that meta-narrative and diverts it in another direction. And so by asking questions and then asking more questions and noticing things about them, like what do they have in common with you and what kind of things could you compliment them on, or throwing the meta-narrative outwards towards them, basically just getting curious about them. Now, if you ever notice, if you've ever seen like a BBC wildlife documentary with David Attenborough, you'll notice that David Attenborough, even though he's in them, it's not really about David Attenborough. He's always very other-focused. And he gets very, very curious about all the creatures or plant life that he's covering. And he'll kneel down and he'll look at this thing in intense detail, this thing that you might have missed. He doesn't miss it, he focuses right in and gets super curious. And so rather than being self-focused, you too can be like David Attenborough and become very, very curious about them instead. And just notice what happens, because like I say, this is an experiment. Notice what happens to the social anxiety when you're not focused on you, when that meta-narrative isn't interrogating you all the time, that you're not being self-conscious, but you're being other-conscious because you're throwing the attention out. What actually happens when you reflect on a conversation where you've done that? Is it easier? Was it more fun? Notice the difference and maybe give it another try if that seems to work. Because going back to that old adage again, if something works, do more of it. And if it doesn't work, it's a sign that it's time to at least try something else. So let's recap. We saw at the start this story about pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing the door over and over and over again, and yet the door really needed to be pulled. We heard that old adage of if something's working, do more, but if it's not, try something else. And we saw how with social anxiety, what happens is that we are very self-focused, and so we miss the benefits of social interaction that should be about nourishment and connection, but instead feel like threat. But it only feels like threat because we become very self-conscious, because we're very, very focused on ourselves. We're asking questions like, what will they think of me? Am I being silly? Do I look a fool? Those kind of things that puts the attention on ourselves, which of course is the very definition of self-conscious, which only makes matters worse for us. And so we saw that just like the push and the pull, doing the opposite could well be the answer. And so the opposite here isn't to be self-conscious, but to be other-conscious. Instead of focusing inward, to focus outward on the other person. And of course, we saw some techniques for doing that as well. Asking questions, asking more questions, asking follow-up questions, getting really curious about the answer, noticing what they have in common, noticing the things that you might compliment them for, diverting the meta-narrative as it comes up, and thinking about whether they are doing those things rather than whether you are. And basically being like David Attenborough, getting really, really super curious about this other person that you're with, and really, really focusing on them and giving them that gift of your interest. And then see what happens when you do that experiment. Because the likelihood is that by being other-focused and being other-conscious, you won't be self-conscious. And you might find that it just makes things a little bit easier for you. So if you like this idea, please share it around so other people can benefit. You can work with me directly one-to-one. I'm Alan Parry, and you can find more at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And you don't have to be local, by the way, because I work online, so you could work with me whatever your location. And of course, please do subscribe to the podcast. There's one every day, and it basically means that you'll never miss an episode again. And of course, it's completely free. So thanks very much for listening. I'll be back again tomorrow with another one.